In America, there are all kinds of debates about the role of fathers and whether fathers are important, whether fathers are necessary. I'm really not here to debate whether fathers are important or not. I'm here to talk about my father and his role in my life. My mother always wanted a boy, she wanted a son, and my father always wanted a girl, he wanted a daughter. I was always, for as long as I can remember, what we now call a daddy's girl. That my father literally never said to me, like, go in the house, talk to your mother. And that's one of the most important things, I think, for children in terms of having a dad. My dad sat me down and said, do you know what my job is as your father? My job as your father is to keep you away from boys for as long as possible, because I used to be a boy and I know how they think. My relationship with my father was very much one of, love and protection. Hey everyone, Brick City Brown Chick coming at you with another episode, and today we are going to talk about dads and their role in the lives of their children. Depending on when you're watching this video, it is just about to be or just has been Father's Day here in the United States. Most of my life, I thought Father's Day was one of those oddly American holidays like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, but actually I found out it's not. It's celebrated in more than 50 countries, including India, Mexico, South Africa, and France. So Father's Day is international. In the United States, Father's Day does not and has never had the, we'll call it cachet or popularity of Mother's Day. Mother's Day in the United States is huge. It is a huge business. It is the day that everybody celebrates their mom. And I did that a little over a month ago with my soon-to-be 92-year-old mother. We go down there every year. We take her out. I made corsages, which is a uniquely, not just a Black American tradition, but it's a Black Southern American tradition. My parents brought it with them when they moved to the North. They were from North Carolina and Georgia. And so ever since I was a very young child, I always followed the tradition of you wear either a wrist corsage, which is what I prefer, or you wear a corsage on your chest. And if your mother is living, you wear a red corsage. And if your mother has passed on, you wear a white corsage. So I made corsages for myself, for my mother, for my husband, and for my two cousins who joined us for dinner. So that's always the traditional Mother's Day celebration. Father's Day, when I was growing up, was always very different. My father was a very low-key, didn't like a lot of attention kind of person. And so my mother and I would go out and buy my father things for Father's Day. Usually it was some combination of these three things. He needed some new ties, he needed some new underwear, or he needed some new handkerchiefs. My father was old school. He carried white handkerchiefs in his pocket. And I mean those old school cloth handkerchiefs that you had to wash, nothing disposable, nothing like that. And so those were sort of the Father's Day options. Sometimes my dad would want to go out for Father's Day, but that was pretty rare. My mother would make a special dinner and we'd all sit down to Father's Day dinner. But Father's Day and Mother's Day were just totally different. And I think that's true in most families. I think most, at least dads of my generation, my parents were silent generation, even though I am Gen X. Most
My
Gen X
parents were
people's
from a different
parents
era
are
entirely.
boomers. My parents are
Looking at these
silent
photos, I
generation.
began
They
to
were born in
understand the
the
world that shaped them.
1930s. So people of that generation just had a very different look at Father's Day. In America, there are all kinds of debates about the role of fathers and whether fathers are important, whether fathers are necessary, and these discussions stem from at one point in the United States, single motherhood, I mean, young single mothers, teens and 20s, was a huge demographic. And people have always wrung their hands and debated about whether single women could, obviously they can, or more often or not should raise children alone. That's always been a huge debate. It gets more complicated when you start talking about women of color, because white people in America like to say it's because people of color are immoral and they don't understand the importance of families and all kinds of other nonsense. Now the discussion about single mothers is more about older women, women in their 30s and 40s, who have never been married and never had children, are making the decision to have children on their own. They have their eggs frozen and they pick a donor, or they have a male best friend and he will give them his sperm and they will have a child, and all sorts of different things. And people are debating whether that's a good idea, whether a woman in her 30s or 40s should be having a child alone. And a lot of those women will tell you, look, I've spent the last 20 years of my life dating and waiting for Mr. Right, as the expression goes, but he hasn't
You
shown
always
up.
think you have all the
And
time
I
in the
don't
world
have another
until you
10
realize
years
that some
to have a
chapters
child.
cannot
There
wait
is a
forever.
biological limit on how long women can have children and how old you want to be when you first become a mother. I give props to women in their 40s who are having their first babies, physically having those babies, and doing it alone. I could not have imagined ever doing that, but props to them that they've got the time and the money and that they want to bring children into this world. That is an amazing thing. All of that is a debate for another day. I'm really not here to debate whether fathers are important or not. I'm here to talk about my father and his role in my life. My parents were married close to 10 years before I was born.
And into the 70s,
And that was purposeful on their part. They married in their mid 20s, and I was born when they were in their mid 30s. They wanted to be settled. They wanted to have traveled and done all those things that you do before you have children. They wanted to have a house, live in a community, and all those things took time, right? So they planned for their future child for several years. So when I was born, my mother was 36 years old. My father was 38 years old. And when I was born in 1970, that was not popular. That was not done. My mother said her obstetrician was like, "Are you sure you want to do this at your age?" I mean, late 30s was not unheard of, obviously, but it was not a thing that happened all the time, right? So it was a big deal. when my mother was pregnant, the whole family was super excited because she was pushing 40 and they thought she was never going to have a child. So when I was born, it was, people were super happy and super joyous. And my mother was uber protective when I was born until I was probably close to 6 months old. She used to make people wear surgical masks around me, like disposable surgical masks, like we all did during a certain pandemic a few years ago. That is what my mother would make people do who came to see me because she said, "You don't understand what I went through to have this child. I'm not just going to let anybody breathe on her and pass on germs." So that's who my mother was when I was born. My parents, of course, like all parents, had discussions about, what they wanted me to be. Sonograms and ultrasounds and all the things that women do today when they're pregnant were in their very beginning stages in the 70s. So you just kind of had to wait, and when your child was born, you would know what they were. My mother always wanted a boy, she wanted a son. And my father always wanted a girl, he wanted a daughter. So obviously, my dad got his wish as opposed to my mom. And it was always an interesting dynamic between my parents and I because I was always, for as long as I can remember, what we now call a daddy's girl. And my father was a girl dad way before any of that was a discussion or was popular or was a thing. I hung out with my dad. If he and his brothers were hanging out on our front porch, I would just sit there and listen because you get all sorts of conversations between men when they don't really think that the child is paying attention. You learn all sorts of ins and outs of their relationship. So I would do that. I would hang out with him when he was fixing his car and help, although I really wasn't that much help because I didn't know any of the tools, but I would do that. And the thing I remember most about those times in my life is that my father literally never said to me, like, go in the house, talk to your mother, I don't want you here right now, whatever. My father was always welcoming and answered my inquisitive questions about whatever he was doing or working on. And that's one of the most important things, I think, for children in terms of having a dad, is having someone who is willing to listen to you and not treat you like a nuisance or like you're just a kid. I learned words from spending time with my parents at a very young age that other children didn't learn. And I don't mean curse words, I just mean words that were far and above my age or my grade level because my parents never talked to me like I was a child. They talked to me like I was one of them, like I was a young adult. And that's always been hugely important in my life. Most people who know me will tell you that I'm a super cerebral person, that I'm very self reflective, and that I do a lot of self examination. And that comes from being my parents' child and being my father's child, especially. My father was very much an introvert. He, like I said earlier, he did not like heaps of attention on him, but he was a school teacher. So, and he taught special education, which I know now is a phrase that most people don't know what that means. What we'd say in modern terms is he taught children that had mental issues, children that we now would look at and say that child is autistic or that child was born addicted to drugs or that child has some other issue. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when my father was teaching, those weren't terms people knew or understood. You just knew that you sent these kids through all sorts of testing, and you found out that they were not on the level of the normal kids, and they needed to be in a special class. To be a special
That is excellent
education
work, David.
teacher
I am very
takes a
proud of you.
whole
Have a good
nother
evening.
level of teaching ability and patience and understanding of children. It is not a job I can imagine doing. But my father did it for 20 odd years and he loved it. He loved his kids. His kids loved him. They would always come back to see him as teenagers
Well,
or as
David, I got
adults
the job for
and
the
talk
summer.
about the things
It's
he did
exactly
for
what we
them.
talked
So
about.
that was
I
just
knew you
really
would.
nice to see. My relationship with my father was very much one of, love and protection. And, the teacher in him always wanted me
They're
to
starting work on a
understand
new library.
situations and
See, just like the
understand how
picture right
things
here.
went. And sometimes our relationship was really comical from my perspective because my father would say things that he really did mean, but I just was kind of like,
Do
Dad,
you really
this
think
one's
history
this
repeats
one's a
itself
doozy.
exactly?
Absolutely.
And one I
Every
remember
generation faces the
particularly
same
is when I
crisis, just
was
with different haircuts.
14, 15, something like that. Now, keep in mind, I went to an all girl Catholic high school. That was my high school. There were no boys. Period. The all boys school was like on the other side of town. It's not like the boys hung out after school. None of that. So that was, my perspective of the
Can't
world
believe you're
was
not at home
I
for
was in
that
an all
tonight. I
girl
know,
school and
but
this
at
was
least
going to
we don't
be
have
my
that
life for
religion
the
class
next
until
4 years.
Friday.
And
Do you want to
yeah,
study
that's just
together
how it
later?
went. My dad sat me down and said, do you know what my job is as your father? And I was like, I guess I don't. Why don't you share? Why don't you clarify? And he said, with a totally straight face and completely seriously, he said, my job as your father is to keep you away from boys for
Now, what
as
is history
long
before you?
as
The key to
possible
understanding the
because
past
I
is
used to
realizing that
be a
people never
boy and
change.
I
It's the
know
same
how they
story, just
think.
different clothes.
And then he just stopped. It was all I could do to hold it together in that moment because I was like, Dad, where are these mysterious
And so, the
boys you're
thematic
talking about?
analysis of the
I go
text
to an
reveals a
all girls
clear
school. I
Augustinian
really don't
influence on the author's
understand.
perspective regarding.
And at the end of his life, last few weeks of his life, when he was very sick, and he had esophagus cancer, so talking was painful and all that.
This
I would
part
go
right
visit
here,
him in the
this
hospital,
is where you tell them about
and
who
it
you
was the
are.
time I was applying for college. It
Don't
was
be afraid to sound
December, it was
confident.
January. It's when you put in your applications and you're waiting to hear back in the day when you had to find out by paper, no such thing as the internet. And he said to me at one point, he said, so
I just don't
we're
know about
going
the
to
early
an all
decision
women's
making.
college,
Have you
right?
considered taking a gap
Because
year to
we're
become a
still
mime?
on the
You're
keeping you away from
ridiculous.
boys thing. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, with all due respect, only if hell is freezing over. I am done with this all women thing. And not because I was boy crazy, and not because, I'm going to go to college and be wild and free. And yeah, that's never been who I am. So it wasn't that. It really was, I was tired and fed up and done. And I wanted to be able to go to class with guys and just see the other side and see the
This
other
one, right
perspective.
here. It's the sensible
So
choice.
Oh,
he
absolutely
was
not.
just like,
I'm
going
going
to
west.
Spelman, right? And I was like, absolutely not. I am not, Dad. I hate to break this to you. I'm just not. So that was always humorous to me. My mother is full of humorous stories about my father when I hit my
Look at
teens,
this. The
as a lot
infamous
of
ski
girls
trip of
do.
'82. Your
Listen, I
father
grew up in the
insisted he was an
80s. I'm a
expert.
true child of the 80s. I grew up with Madonna. and Cyndi Lauper and Jodie Watley and Grace Jones and Shaka Khan, women who made statements with what they wore. And so because I wore an ugly brown polyester uniform 5 days a week, on the weekends, I was gonna be, the cool girl, the hot girl, whatever. So I had like spandex skirts to beat the band and fingerless gloves and ridiculous tights. I mean, just absolutely crazy 80s ridiculous stuff. And my father would never say it directly to me, but he would say things to my mother like, are we seriously going to let her go out of the house like I look at what girls wear today and I think my parents got off really easy. I mean, I was not, I wore skirts just above my knee because I knew my parents would be like, okay, hold the phone. And my mother's response to that was, listen, she's got her own job. I worked in a clothing store. It's like, she's got her own job. She makes her own money. How exactly are we supposed to say you can't wear that because she bought that with her own money? Like, it's fine. But he was not happy about my wardrobe, like I'm sure most parents aren't. But it was just interesting as I got older listening to those stories that he would never say that to me. He would say it to my mother in terms of like saying, okay, we play good cop, bad cop. You're the bad cop. You tell her she can't wear that. And my mother was like, no, I'm not playing that game with her. And the funniest story I think I remember my mother telling from when I was a very young child is, according to her, when I was like 3 years old, 2, 3, after I'd learned to walk and sort of got a good handle on it, she said I fell a lot. So she concluded from that I was clumsy. Okay, I don't know exactly how you determine a 3-year-old is clumsy, but that's where we were. And so she decided, as my mother, she needed to do something about that. So she went to the library because, again, pre-internet, you had to do things the hard way to do your research. She went to the library and started researching. And she came back and sat my father down and said, okay, listen, she's a clumsy mess and we got to do something about this. So we have two choices. We can either put her in gymnastics or put her in dance. Like, those are the options. She needs to get some grace and she needs to figure it out and learn how to move. And we've got to facilitate that because we're her parents and that's our job. And she said my father thought about it for a minute because he was very thoughtful and just very pragmatic. My father was just very sensible. He was going to take the sensible solution. So he looked at her and said, well, if you think she's clumsy, I really don't think leaping off a balance beam is a good idea. My mother agreed and was like, okay, dance it is. And into dance I went because that's how they made their decisions. So I just want to say on this Father's Day to everybody who has a dad or had a great dad growing up, make sure you celebrate. Make sure you think about them and the good times you spent with them. And I wish my father, Moses Ezekiel Zachariah, yes, those were actually his names, they were very Old Testament, a very happy Heavenly Father's Day. I want to thank everybody for joining me this week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.